Okay, so now we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about Marr's levels of analysis. This is also in some books, this is called the tri-level hypothesis. Um, and I think I want to, it has two things to it. So Marr's levels of analysis, he applies this idea to vision, and he comes out with his own little theory of vision. I'm sure people find it convincing, that theory, but I get the sense that the real contribution of this theory is that is the way that he talks about cognition, right? So not necessarily how he applies this idea to vision, but more so what the idea is, right? So Marr's levels of analysis, as it says, it is about he's basically saying to understand how cognition works, you need to understand it on multiple different levels, right? That is, in order to understand how the mind works, it's not sufficient to simply look at how the brain works. And one critical assumption here is that the mind is not reducible to brain activity. It's not the case that you can just look how the brain, how neurons fire in the brain to figure out how the mind works. Of course, this isn't to say that the mind is irrelevant, right? It is definitely it's true that our brain determines our cognitive activity, but the important thing is that the rules of the mind emerge as something that is separate from brain activity, right? And this doesn't, we're not saying that they're separate in the sense that, the mind is like a soul or that we're living in a simulation. Um, I I think the best way to talk about this is if you think about the intro lecture, right? Recall that the mind is analogous to like the software, whereas the brain is more like the hardware. And of course, you need the hardware to carry out the software, but they're separate things, they're separate entities. Um, so even though the coding or the rules of the software, yeah, as I said, as even though the coding or the rules of the software are implemented through the hardware of the computer, they are nevertheless separate things that you should study. And knowing how the hardware of a computer works will not tell you how a given software works. The emergent behavior of a system cannot be understood from just looking at how electricity flows through the circuits and logic gates inside the hardware. And similarly, knowing how the software works won't necessarily tell you how the hardware works, right? So, of course, it may be that knowing how the hardware of a computer works may help one in understanding how the software works and vice versa, right? It's not that they can't help each other understand. It's not the case that hardware and software um, can't help you understand each level, right? But the point is that they're separate levels of understanding, and one level cannot be reduced to another, or neither of the levels can be replaced by the other, right? It's not like if we just understood one level, the brain, we would be able to figure out the mind. And this, I would say, this distinction, I'm not sure how important it is for all systems, but it's definitely um, important for cognition, right? So, for example, if you want to understand how a car works, you may be able to get away by just simply looking at under the hood, right? So to speak, like the brain of the car. But this just isn't the case for cognition. All right, so the idea here is that there are three levels. There's the computational level, and this level can be described as, in a nutshell, defining the problem, right? So it involves identifying the input that a cognitive system is given, as well as what the output needs to be. Um, the algorithmic level is more about determining the solution behind that problem, right? So this explains how the cognitive system actually executes the task, right? How is the input actually relate to the output? Whereas the implementational level is about determining how that algorithm or solution gets implemented physically, right? So involves identifying the physical structures that will realize the representational stages over which an algorithm is defined, and to find the mechanisms at the sort of neural level, if you're talking about the brain, that can be properly described as computing the algorithm. So the algorithmic level, importantly, is sort of on an abstract level. It's not necessarily tied to any particular physical system. And a lot of undergraduates hate this distinction between implementation and algorithm. A lot of students will say they're the same thing. And I'm hopefully I can sort of um, get you to avoid that way of thinking. And to start, I'll talk about a quote that David Marr gave. And it is basically saying an algorithm, right, a solution to a problem is likely to be understood more readily by understanding the nature of the problem being solved rather than understanding the mechanism as it is hardware, so to speak, in which it is embodied. Right. So, in a similar vein, trying to understand perception by studying only the neurons is like trying to understand bird flight by studying only the feathers. It just can't be done. In order to understand bird flight, we have to understand aerodynamics. Only then does the structure of the feathers and the different shapes of bird wings actually make sense. Okay. So, following this flight metaphor, right, at the computational level, this involves determining what the goal is, what the problem is, how it's defined, what the input is that yields the output. So if it's flying, the goal is to fly. The problem is, how does the bird move in the air despite being heavier than air, right? So that's the constraint, the fact that it's heavier, right? And then the output is maybe this is where the analogy kind of breaks down, but the output may be the actual act of flying through the air, and the input may be the wings, the feathers, the weight of the bird, that kind of thing. Whereas the algorithmic level is all about the problem or about how the problem gets solved. So what are the rules, right? This is where the rules of aerodynamics come into play, right? So what are the rules that are taken or need to be taken in order to solve the problem of flying? And this is, in this situation, I'm talking about a bird, but the algorithm, right, or the rules are often on an abstract level. They're not talking about how do birds fly. They're just saying, what are the rules of aerodynamics in general? And that could be, those rules could be applied to a plane, um, a bird, birds of all kinds of weights, that kind of thing. So it's on an abstract level. It isn't tied necessarily to any specific physical system. So in this case, the problem of flying is solved by the rules of aerodynamics. And in this case, the rules of aerodynamics would be the explanation of flying at the algorithmic level. So in contrast, the implementational level would specify how the algorithm is physically implemented. How does a bird implement the rules of aerodynamics? If we're talking about a plane. How does a plane implement the rules of aerodynamics? Okay. All right. And so this is David Marr right here. He actually died very young. I think he died at 35, which is my age. Um, he was also like a giant in cognitive science. And there's surprisingly very few pictures of him. This is one that I found. Um, Nevertheless, here's the idea. So we can think of cognition in a similar way, right? There are many problems a cognitive system is faced with: color perception, depth perception, sound localization, language, speech comprehension, speech production. These are all problems, right? And understanding the problem on a computational level requires you to define the problem correctly, which requires you to understand a number of important things about the problem. Right. And so, uh, for example, what problem or problems must be solved in order for a cognitive system to, solve vision, right? And so maybe one way to think about this is, if the one way to think about the computational level is how would you define the problem of vision with enough precision and correctly to begin programming a computer or a robot to see things? And understanding at the computational level critically requires that you frame the problem correctly, focusing on things that matter while ignoring things that don't matter, right? So I would argue that often this is the case that philosophers live on this computational level, right? They're all about defining the problem. They don't necessarily give any solutions always or test any solutions to the problem, right? However, you don't have to be a philosopher. You can also um, develop a model or a theory that simply tries to describe the behavior of a system without any description of what steps or solutions are taken or need to be taken. In this case, the theory would just be trying to explain the problem on a computational level in a very precise and accurate way. The algorithmic level is all about determining how the problem could be solved on an abstract level, right? So what steps are taken or rules are followed in order to solve the problem? How does the cognitive system, for example, extract visual information from the world in a way that can be processed further? And then you can also, of course, develop a theory or a model that tries to explain what steps are taken to solve the problem, right? So you can have computational level theory, and you can also have an algorithmic level theory as well. Um, Finally, the implementation level deals with how the solution on the algorithmic level gets implemented in a given physical system or our physical system. And here you can also develop a model or a theory that attempts to explain how the steps are implemented in the brain. Of course, it's probably hard to do that if you don't have an understanding of the algorithmic level, but you can nevertheless do that once you have some idea of what the algorithmic level, what's going on the algorithmic level. Okay, so most of this lecture will just be, that's the idea, right? It's a very simple idea. Sorry, this is a little bit longer than 10 minutes, but the basic idea has been laid out, and now we're going to go over like a ton of examples to try and reinforce the idea, okay? Um, yeah, so, okay, see you then.